first session of the second round of the consultative preliminary meeting between the government delegation and opposition figures opens in Moscow this morning. Syrian Arab army units target terrorist dens in several areas in the countryside of Idlib, Hama, Dar'a and Al-Qunaitira, eliminating dozens of terrorists. The Saudi aggression against Yemen continues as airstrikes kill and wound dozens of people, mostly women and children. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Irado Krikorian from the News Center in Damascus. The Syrian Arab Republic government's chief delegate to the second round of the Inter-Syrian preliminary consultative meeting in Moscow, Dr. Bashar al-Jafari, has announced the Syrian government's approval of the agenda presented by moderator Professor Vitaly Naumkin according to the observed order of its items. During the first session of the second round of the consultative preliminary meeting, which opened in Moscow this morning, al-Jafari said, "Everybody knows that what Syria has been exposed to for more than 4 years aims at undermining the state and its political, economic, social and cultural structure. No sane person would be convinced that a revolution happens whose commanders are Abu Omar the Chechen, Abu Suhaib the Libyan, Abu Bakr the Baghdadi, Abu John the British, Abu Abdullah the Jordanian, Abu Talha the Kuwaiti, Abu Ghuthan the Saudi and others on a very long list," al-Jafari said. "No wonder," he went on, "why certain Arab regional and international governments have refrained from closing down the websites that promote, instigate and recruit terrorists in Syria." "What about the commitments," Mr. al-Jafari asked, "undertaken by the governments of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Jordan, Turkey, Israel, France, the USA and other states to implement relevant Security Council's resolutions which call for preventing the recruiting, funding, training, arming and harboring of terrorists and their passage into Syrian and Iraqi territories?" Al-Jafari affirmed that the Syrian government expects from its partners in the opposition to take clear stands and deeds that live up to the national responsibility, so that we would work together to maintain a national dialogue which seeks to reach the appropriate formula and mechanisms that would realize the Syrian state's supreme national interests, he asserted. The first session has meanwhile been adjourned before the opposition reached any agreement among themselves on the presented agenda. The moderator of the Inter-Syrian preliminary consultative meeting in Moscow, Vitaly Naumkin, has presented the agreed-upon basic points of the second round of the meeting between the Syrian Arab Republic's government delegation and figures from the opposition, namely, assessment of the current situation in Syria, the potentials and objectives of unifying the national forces in the country in the face of present challenges, including international terrorism, the possible confidence-building measures by the government, the opposition and the civil society forces, the basis of the political process, including the Geneva Statement provisions, the steps necessary to be taken in order to advance towards national reconciliation and the settlement of the crisis. It is naturally up to the participants in the meeting themselves to reach a final agenda that remains free and unofficial, he said. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said Moscow welcomes the agreement of more Syrian opposition forces to find a peaceful solution to the conflict in Syria. During a joint press conference he held with his Armenian counterpart Eduard Nalbandian in Moscow, Lavrov said Moscow notes down changes in the West's accent towards President Bashar al-Assad as certain ideas have started to be raised, the talk about which had just not been accepted a very short time ago. Lavrov pointed out that the preliminary consultative meeting in Moscow for the third consecutive day includes 60% of the opposition. To the news on the ground, the Syrian Arab Army has eliminated terrorist gatherings and destroyed their bulldozer in the camp of the displaced families downtown Daraa. The Syrian Arab Army also targeted al-Nusra terrorists and destroyed their vehicles in Kafr Shams and Inkhil in Daraa countryside. Armed men have moreover been killed or wounded in As-Suwaida eastern suburb, particularly in Al-Qasr village. In Homs countryside, the whole members of a terrorist gang have been killed west of Sharshuh, as others have also been targeted in 7 other villages. Armed men were meanwhile attacked and eliminated in 10 villages in Idlib suburb and Hama northwestern countryside. In Al-Hassaka countryside, the engineering units of the Syrian Arab Army defused 9 explosive devices that were planted in a car on the road of Al-Shaddadi Al-Hassaka. A source in the governorate said that the Syrian Arab Army unit monitored a Kia Cerato car parked on the road, and after examining it, 9 explosive devices of weights that range between 30 and 60 kilograms each were found inside. The source asserted that an explosive specialized engineering unit reached the site and dismantled the explosives. Minister of State for National Reconciliation Affairs Dr. Ali Haidar has discussed with member of the PLO Executive Committee Ahmed Majdalani the current circumstances in Al-Yarmouk camp and the Syrian government's role in providing protection, security and stability to the Palestinians in the light of the crisis confronting Syria. He also discussed the file of the relief and humanitarian effort in opening secure paths and saving the inhabitants from the killing practiced by the terrorist ISIL organization. On his part, Majdalani said ISIL's and al-Nusra's control of Al-Yarmouk camp has created a new situation which makes it difficult to talk about an imminent political solution in the camp. With the support of the Syrian government and with the supervision of Higher Committee for Relief, the General Authority for the Palestinian Refugees, in cooperation with the UNRWA, distributed during the past few days assistance to the citizens who left Al-Yarmouk camp fleeing the crimes committed by the terrorist groups there. The Arab Palestinian Refugees Authority said in a statement that the assistance, including food, medicine and clothes, were distributed to the displaced citizens residing currently at a sheltering center in At-Tadamun. The statement authority added that coordination is underway to provide assistance to the displaced people in Yelda very soon. The authority had pointed out that the ongoing fierce clashes between the terrorist groups in Al-Yarmouk prevented many residents from reaching the distribution sites where assistance is delivered. Over to Yemen, where the Saudi aggression continued as more than 180 children have been killed by Saudi airstrikes since the beginning of the military campaign. 2 people were killed in the capital Sana'a during an airstrike on at Tikhraf village in Sanahan district. 3 children and 2 women were killed when a Saudi airstrike targeted their homes in Beit Rijal area near the capital. 12 people were killed, mostly civilians, in Khishar area, as 6 students were also killed in the district of Lib when Saudi warplanes shelled the school. In the city of Saada, 18 people were killed, including 9 members of one family in Al-And area in Sanahan district. Meanwhile, the U.S. has announced that it is boosting up its military aid to Saudi Arabia. The U.S. Deputy Secretary of Defense Anthony Blinken, during a current visit to the Saudi capital, announced that his country is speeding up its military support to the Saudi regime in its war against Yemen. Iraqi army liberated 7 towns and villages in Al-Anbar province, killing a number of ISIL terrorists. Head of Al-Anbar Government Council, Sabah Karhout, announced that the military operations to liberate all the towns and districts of the province have started. In a statement to the press, he made it clear that the operations were launched today in a Syria area east of Al-Ramadi. Iraqi airstrikes targeted ISIL supply routes in a Syria area. One Palestinian was shot and killed by Israeli occupation soldiers south of Nablus in the West Bank. Meanwhile, hundreds of settlers supported by Israeli troops broke into Yusuf Tomb near Bulata camp east of Nablus and performed prayers for hours there. The Israeli troops used tear gas and sound bombs against Palestinian citizens, causing 10 students to suffer suffocation in Beit Amr north of Hebron. Now to latest business and market news, but after a short break, stay tuned. The first session of the second round of the consultative preliminary meeting between the government delegation and opposition figures opens in Moscow this morning. The second round of the Inter-Syrian preliminary consultative meeting in Moscow, Dr. Bashar al-Jafari has announced the Syrian government's approval of the agenda presented by moderator Professor Vitaly Naumkin according to the observed order of its items. During the first against Yemen continues as airstrikes kill and wound dozens of people, mostly women and children. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Irado Krikorian from the News Center in Damascus. The Syrian Arab Republic government's chief delegate to Syrian Arab Army units target terrorist dens in several areas in the countryside of Idlib, Hama, Dar'a and Al-Qunaitira, eliminating dozens of terrorists. The Saudi aggression